SC Media is proud to present this month's CISO Stories program, hosted by yours truly, Jessica Hoffman. This is a show where CISOs share tales from the trenches and unpack leadership lessons learned along the way. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. The Cyber Risk Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, please visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CRC. Greetings, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of CISO Stories Podcast with your host, yours truly, Jess Hoffman. I have a very, very special dear guest with us today, LaLisha Hurt. I can't tell you how much I'm so grateful for you being on the show, LaLisha. How you doing today?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me, Jess.
Yes, we go back a while. I like to tell stories, Started off as a client and then friend, mentor, you doing your thing. I said to you one time many years ago, I guess now, that I wanted to grow up and be a CISO, and you're like, oh, and now, crack. It's just so amazing. I'm mad I missed you last week. It looked like a lot of fun at the Uniting Women in Cyber Guild. You doing your thing, running all over the place as a beacon of women in cyber, which is amazing. Thank you for doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you were missed, but there's always next year, Jess.
Yes, always next year. So we're talking about tool selection this month with the CISO Story series, and I know that you've had a lot of experience in CISO roles and sales engineering and everything in between there when it comes to cyber. So I'm sure you've had a lot of experiences with tool selection, some good, some bad,
Yes.
some ugly, some beautiful, right?
Oh, yeah.
So when we were talking the other day, you mentioned you like to categorize it as far as tool rationalization. So what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so also tool rationalization, tool consolidation, tool selection, whatever you want to call it. But for me, when I think about tool rationalization, it's just really the process of evaluating, streamlining, optimizing the tools within your organization, right? To just ensure that they're efficient, right? They're cost effective, can't leave out the cost part. And right, it's necessary for achieving business and mission goals. And you like to tell stories. I like to tell stories. I do analogies. I like to break it down for folks, right? So I equate tool rationalization to shopping for a car, right? You assess why you need the car, which is your requirements. Based on those requirements, you shop around, right? You test drive some cars or demo them to see how they function against your requirements. And then you make the best decision based on all the data and information you collected, right? Over time, you evaluate it, right? Is this still the right car for me? You validate its performance. How well is it on gas? And you constantly got to maintain it, right? So you keep it for as long as possible, as long as it still aligns to your needs and wants, right? And so this is the same process for tool rationalization. And this is important to organizations because you know this, Jess, I know this, we've been in this space for a while. You tend to start to accumulate a wide range of tools. You just buy and then you realize that many of them have overlapping features, right? So by rationalizing tools, organizations can reduce, things like unnecessary licensing costs, right? Support costs and maintenance efforts. It can also improve data flows, right? Reduce those silos and enhance analytics, making it easier for organizations to derive insights from data. And then lastly, scalability, right? By consolidating tools and reducing reliance on legacy systems, right? Jess, you remember people still have mainframes, they still probably do, right? Organizations can position themselves for growth and make it easier to adopt new technologies and new capabilities like AI and automation.
So as far as buying a car or buying a tool, that means I shouldn't buy that 2025 BMW 750 Li and park it outside on 13th and Market Street, right?
Hey, you can. Hey, if it fits your requirements, your must-haves and all that good stuff, it may be the right one for you. But hey, you got to evaluate and assess it for you.
Well, it don't fit on the street of Philadelphia. That's what I'm saying.
There you go. That's like one of the
Probably not a
requirements.
good idea. Probably not a good idea. No, I love that. Absolutely true, and that's like an analogy everybody can relate to. And I can't emphasize we can't emphasize enough about the budget and consolidation. We were just talking about that from like a state level, or even with an organization or parent, child, whatever. When you have everybody getting their own licenses, that costs way more than if there was one single contract and then multiple licenses under that. So I think that gets discounted sometimes because you're like, how can we squeeze money or allocate additional funding within our budget? And if you really look at your licenses, it's almost like a guarantee you're going to find some money right there if you just consolidate.
Yep.
So yeah, I love that. And you mentioned before too about like a vendor day. How did that work out as far as, bringing all your vendors together? I guess you going back to like specific requirements, right? Figuring out exactly what you need the tool for, interviewing the right people
Yep.
that would be using the tool and so forth. And then
Yeah.
you bring all the vendors together for vendor day. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I want to talk about the process in general because I feel like the vendor day was something that was kind of in state, but I want to talk about the process to get there. So, the first thing I do for myself, or if I'm working with partners or customers in this space, is to, ask some fundamental questions just to get a better understanding of your tool landscape. Because the last thing you want to do is go out here and buy a bunch of stuff and you may or may not need it, right? So, going back to our GRC days, right, you want to perform that risk assessment, do that inventory, right, of what you have in place currently before you even start the process, right? So some of the questions to ask yourself is, how many tools do you have for security and observability? What challenges do you have with these tools, and how much time, right, and effort would you estimate it takes to use and keep these tools up and running? Do you know how your tools are being used, right? Do you know what capabilities align to which tools and who's using them? And then going back to the cost, right? How do you rationalize IT spending or talk about it with your board or your executive leadership? And the response that I get a lot from customers and people that I work with is, we don't really even talk about this with our executive leadership team or board. And so that's one thing that you should be doing pretty regularly. And then once you understand that baseline, right, you got a good understanding of what's in house already and how you use it. You want to really identify the capabilities and requirements you need in order to fulfill your business goals, not just for today, but also for the future. Like, what are the things you're going to need for the future? When you think about scalability. And then I would categorize these requirements into must haves, like to have, and nice to have, right? Going back to that car analogy in the beginning, what are your non-negotiables for buying that car? What are some of the features you would like to have? And then what are those bells and whistles just you want on that BMW 700 series, right? In order to, have a fun and comfortable experience, right? That's kind of like your wants, but not necessarily your needs. And then once you have that requirements list, which hopefully you pull together, by using a group of diverse people like your engineers, your end users of the tools, just so you have a comprehensive view. You want to do your homework and research the top vendors or players that provide these capabilities. And many people, including myself, I leverage Gartner's Magic Quadrant for this data because it has been vetted, it has been validated, and it's automatically broken out by categories and functionality. So it makes it easier to determine who's the leader in this space, right? Or top three leaders in this space. And then that's when the fun begins. In my prior life as a CISO, I would set up what I like to call, you mentioned industry days, right? We used to call them vendor days, but now I call them industry days. And this is where you bring in all of your vendors that meet your must-have criteria that they're considered leaders in this space because you looked at Gartner and other areas in the industry to figure out who's leading. And then you would have your requirements team interview them, right? It's almost like speed dating, right? They get a chance to talk to you about the value of the capabilities, not just the product, but their capabilities, right? If you have enough time, right, they can demo this for you and share whatever it is they like to share in a lot of time that you have. And then you evaluate them, right? You discuss the experience, hopefully come to a decision point for tool selection to replace or enhance what you currently have in place. And typically, some of the things that you look at that are main drivers are things like functionality, ease of integration and use, scalability, and then obviously cost and security and compliance are kind of the big ones that I typically looked at to make those data driven decisions.
Yeah, vendor day, that's pretty common within the federal agencies. So, yeah, I think that's a great way to approach it and saves time too,
Yeah.
right? But starting with the planning process when we were, I'm sure you agree, being an auditor, you put a lot of time into the planning phase,
Yeah.
and that makes all the difference when it comes to actually doing the assessment. And then obviously the reporting is the byproduct of that. So I love it. I think we should just call it speed vendor speed dating.
There you go.
That just sounds so much fun. Uh, and by the way, I want everything on my BMW. So you mentioned something, that just sparked a thought too about, proper planning. So we all know that as far as which tools you want and the services or the functionality you need from that tool. And we know that most tools nowadays, security tools, have a wide range of capabilities. It's not just one tool for, SIM, one tool for
Hmm.
IDS, one tool for EDR. These tools nowadays cover pretty much everything. And we know that there's multiple tools that do the same thing within an organization. And when I first started being an auditor, I'm like, why do you have five different inventory management
Right.
systems? Right.
Right.
So that's a whole nother conversation as far as system of records there. But, um, every organization doesn't have, that kind of budget. So
Hmm.
sometimes you really have to look at these tools, procurement and the selection, per phases. So in your experience or when you're talking to clients, say that, I say, I need tools for this and this. So if I can get a tool that does all of it, great, but I only have money for this right now. So what kind of advice or what's your thought process as far as like, okay, well, I have this is my budget, this is what I need right now.
Yeah.
Is it better to work with the vendor to see if you can work on some pricing going forward, rollout, or do you just settle for whatever tool you can afford right now and then hope you get enough budget later on to keep piling on? Just, these real world issues, right? Because obviously it is a problem for
Yeah.
everybody.
Absolutely. So I worked on both sides of the fence where I had a very decent budget and I worked in places where I had, a very small budget. So the approach is a little bit different, but I think at the end of the day you still can reach the right outcome. And I say that because sometimes you don't need five different tools when you can choose one tool that does all of those five things for you, right? And so this is where I strongly recommend aligning to a platform, right? Removing products and tools, but you want a single platform that can do multiple things for you, right? Satisfy multiple requirements versus having to buy multiple tools, right? And so, believe it or not, just more than 3 and 4 organizations are actually looking to consolidate in the space of security and in the space of observability, right? Just logging, monitoring, visibility capabilities. And the reality of it is you can find this in one tool, right? Now, will it be in your budget? That's something you're going to have to negotiate and talk about, but there's ways to get around that for your budget. And I think that's where you sit down and do that speed dating. And so, what I constantly hear, from customers in the space is we want to complement what we're already doing, right? Rather than create redundancy, waste, and counterproductive overlap. And I think that's the goal. You probably can save costs and money if you sunset the gazillion tools that you have in your space already or that you don't even realize you have, right? Until you do the inventory and you realize that I didn't even know we had this tool. Like, who is even using it, right? But you're spending money on it every year and you didn't realize it. So I think that's why it's important to do that rationalization and review and evaluation up front because you can find cost savings in your existing environment that you can apply to your new, replacement tools. And so I'll just give an example of in the food and beverage industry, and this is public, so I can share it. Heineken, I'm sure we're all familiar with Heineken. They operate across more than 70 markets, which led to a fragmented IT landscape with a variety of tools and systems being used across different regions, right? So this decentralization resulted in obviously inconsistent processes, those high operational costs that we talked about, Jess, and also just difficulty in collaboration and data silos, making it difficult to gain unified insights and monitor performance consistently. So, as a part of their approach, they actually launched a global digital transformation initiative to rationalize their IT tools and systems. And their goal was really to just simplify and standardize their IT landscape across all markets, right? Meaning fewer tools, consolidating all of their collaboration and communication tools. That's a whole nother topic because, people accumulate all these collaboration tools and communication tools over time. That's a whole different topic outside of security. And then they wanted to unify IT service management into one single platform. So they have all of these challenges across, various teams and functions. And the end result was that they had 100% visibility into over 3,000 systems. I can't imagine trying to keep up with 3,000 systems, but they did. They had less than 20 invoices with errors per day in one location and 25 million monthly app messages in one view, right, to take proactive measures against. And I think that's the challenge, right? When you have a bunch of systems, you got a bunch of dashboards, a bunch of reports, but they're not talking to each other. They're not integrated, right? So how do you make those informed decisions when you don't have that single pane of glass, that single platform? And I think that's the key to really gaining efficiencies, but also staying ahead of some of these security threats that are in our space today.
And that's great example of just the global landscape for these international companies such as Heineken and many others. Um, so we're talking about tool selection, want to emphasize we're not just talking about security tool selection. We're talking about IT tools, period, across your entire organization. So when you're doing tool rationalization, you're sitting down and defining the business requirements and needs, and even optimizing and reviewing what you already have in place. It's not just about security related tools. We're looking at IT requirements, tool requirements as a whole.
Yep.
I think that's where that example emphasize that too, right? Because they're probably looking at their ticketing systems,
Yep.
maybe a Jira or with source code for development type of deal, what they're using for web applications and so forth. So yeah, that's great. I don't know if we've actually said that on this show for the tool selection. Like we're not just talking about security controls, although as security professionals, it's kind of like, we're just thinking about security, right? So that's a great example. The global aspect, I think,
Mhm.
could be very, very intense and challenging for sure. Along that note too, just talking about having one or potentially having one tool that does multiple things and maybe even going specifically to security. So we have a tool that does our inventory management, maybe some EDR. They're monitoring our email security. Yeah, there could be, just a bunch of things that this one tool is doing. And that's the only tool that we have. And they do a great job. But what happens when that tool is no longer available? So as far as being like a single point of failure, and like going back to what I said a moment ago, when I first started auditing and was getting to know what all these different tools were and why organizations had so many of the same, not saying that was the best thing to do either,
Mhm.
right? Because to your comment at the beginning, we have these tools that we don't even know all the proper capabilities or they're not being used. So I was perplexed. Like, why do you have 5 tools that do the same thing? Looking at it, if you're looking at it from like defense in depth or just having that backup to the backup to the backup, should, one go down. But I think it's much easier and it's more attractive too to have one tool that does all these things. But just my my default thought is like, well, what happens if that system goes down?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Such a valid point, right? And this is where your contingency, business, disaster recovery plan, all that comes into place. And that's something you should actually sit down with the vendor or your partner, right, in the beginning and say, hey, I'm putting all my eggs in one basket, right? I feel like this is the efficient, effective way to do it. But walk me through how we're going to, respond or how we're going to recover in the event that, something's not available or something's not working, right? And so that is a valid point, and it should be a key requirement of your, planning process to say, hey, if I choose to use a single pane of glass, let's talk contingency. Let's talk prioritization, right? Because I'm sure that partner or vendor has other customers besides just Jess, besides just LaLisha. Where do I fall on that list, right? Am I at the bottom? Am I at the top? Like, who do I call? What's that process, right? So that's something that you definitely have to work out and figure out, where's the failover, right? What's the process for bringing us back up, and what's the SLA? That's key in the contract. Like, what are you agreeing to? What can I hold you accountable for? And all of that stuff should be discussed and, more importantly, put in the contract with whatever partner you choose. Valid
So
question.
it all breaks down the risk. Yeah. So see, GRC rule the world. Okay. We make the best leaders here. We're looking
Everything
at
goes back
everything.
to everything goes back to GRC, right? You can't get away from it. Like, yeah, everything has a risk associated with it, and it's just a matter of how much risk are we willing to take, and what does that process look like. So I'm glad you brought that up because that's a really valid point.
So, just a couple more questions. We're coming up on time, but let's talk about metrics
Yeah.
here as far as measurement. So you went in detail about leading up to the vendor day and having the vendor day and then scoring based on your business requirements and criteria. And then we select an amazing tool that fits all our needs and we're very, very happy. So then what?
So then, like going back to that car analogy, you purchased it, but you want to make sure it's still doing the things that you need it to do, right? You're still maintaining it. And so you want to measure the effectiveness of it, right? That tool. And so I want to break this down by category because there's a ton of metrics. You know this, Jess. People have a gazillion metrics, but you want to break it down into categories and maybe have a few. So the first one is effectiveness and performance, right? If you want to measure that for a tool, let's say it is a security tool, mean time to detect is key, right? This measures the average time it takes to detect that incident or that issue, right? The lower the MTTD indicates a better tool effectiveness, right? If that's key for you. Mean time to respond, I don't want to just detect, right? I want to measure how quickly the tool is going to help me resolve this issue once I detect it, right? Faster response time indicates higher efficiency in most cases. We talked about that contingency plan, right? I want to measure system uptime and downtime, right? What good is this tool if it's not available to me 99.9999% of the time, right? So for monitoring and management tools, the percentage of time the system is available versus unavailable is critical, right? And so we talked about that. If you want to measure costs, right, which everyone does, you would not be purchasing this and not thinking about costs. So total cost of ownership is a good one, right? This includes not just the initial purchase price of the tool, but also the costs related to implementation, maintenance, updates, and support. Going back to the car analogy, you got to maintain it, right? It's not going to maintain itself. You need tires, you need oil changes, right? You need brakes. Same thing with your tools. It needs to be fine-tuned and updated periodically. Licensing fees versus usage, right? You want to evaluate whether the company is fully utilizing the paid licenses or features, or if there's an over or under provisioning, right? Those are things you want to keep an eye on. And then productivity, right? Automation rate, right? If you're trying to get out of the business of doing stuff manually, right? You want a percentage of tasks that you can tell or not whether it's automated versus manual. So the higher the automation often leads to improved productivity, right? In most cases. Measure time savings, right? Process improvements. These are things that we forget about, but these things add up for productivity, right? If it's saving your team's time, your security team from having to go through all of that stuff manually, they get 8 hours back in the day. Guess what? That's 8 hours they can focus on something else that's more high value for the organization. And then I'll just lastly say ROI, right? Anything we do, what's the return on the investment? Compare the financial benefit or savings generated by the tool with the total cost of ownership. A positive ROI indicates the tool's value. It's something you can talk to your executives about, right? It's something you can talk to your board about. It's something that you can hang your hat on to help you get more funding and budget for year after year. And then, of course, you have a tons of other metrics I didn't mention, right, that fall in compliance or risks, user experience, and impact from a business perspective. These all can be measured, and it just really depends on what's the priority of your organization.
That's great. I hope you guys are rewinding and taking notes because those are all fantastic metrics to help you optimize the tool, save time for your team, but also advocate for more funding and buy-in from executive leadership because we know that is not a one and done. We're continuously advocating for why we need the resources that we need, and metrics are a huge part of that. So thank you, Alicia. And I love that car analogy. I'm sorry, just every time you say that, I think I did have a 750. I've had a couple and like I can only go to the dealership and it's so expensive and that's what we do. We want this luxury, but it costs a lot of money.
Right.
So one of our guests before was talking about investing in startup companies, right?
Mm,
Which they might give you better product, but it's not as experienced in the game as far as, know that we're going to be around for a while and that trusted name and so forth. So there's a lot of trade-offs when we're
yeah.
talking about how much something costs. Because I'm sure you agree, just because it's a cheaper or more affordable doesn't mean that it's the best product for
Right.
us. So thank you for those details. I love it. You're so organized. This is great. So I want to ask you the last question here, but thank you very much for that. I'm glad that we were able to share this with others. Again, the vendor day or industry day is pretty common in government. And maybe folks listening don't necessarily call it that, but they
Mhm.
have some organized fashion of talking to multiple vendors at once. So, thanks for bringing that to the front because I think that is definitely a huge takeaway of how we can handle this in the most, um, efficient way to make sure we're getting what we need. So, LaLisha, my last question is, what would the now LaLisha tell 18-year-old LaLisha? What advice would you give her?
How did I know you're going to ask that, Jess? I feel like you ask that question every time we get together, and my answer probably is different because I have a lot of things that I want to tell my 18-year-old self. Um, Gosh, it would be a full conversation. But again, for me, it would be bold, be brave, use your voice, but also try different things, take risk, right? Because some of the things that, at least for me personally, I probably would have never imagined for myself from a career perspective, like you and I talked about the CISO thing, right? Like this was not on my dream list, this was not on my wish list, but here we are. And so for me, it was taking those calculated risks, trying different stuff, putting myself in uncomfortable spaces that I may not have been. But for me, I would just tell myself to do more of that early on at 18, probably would have got me where I wanted to be a little bit faster, a little bit sooner. But I am thankful and grateful for the experiences that I've had thus far. But I wish I would have done those things a lot sooner. Things like, connect with Jess, find a mentor, a sponsor, like all those things that we tell others now that we may not have taken advantage of to our full extent. I probably would redo that over again.
I feel that, but I do know that everything happens when it should too.
That's
So
good.
us meeting those years ago and had no idea we would be sitting here together talking about tool selection.
Right, right.
Like Wow, that did not ever come across the desk there. But you're awesome, LaLisha. I appreciate you so much as my mentor and just a role model for all CISOs, women out there, people of color. You and your family do a lot of work down in Richmond, philanthropy, giving back to the community. So, I know that's a big part of who you are in your heart. So, I'm just very, very grateful for your friendship and you coming on and sharing all your gems with the world. So
Thank
thank
you
you
so
so much.
much, Jess. Thanks for having us. And anytime you want to hang out, I'm always down to hang out with you. You're doing amazing things for the city, and I appreciate all that you're doing. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you too. And thanks to all the listeners. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode. Thanks for joining.